Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. For most of human history, hundreds of thousands of years, humans have lived a mostly nomadic life in which they found their food by foraging, hunting, and gathering in the very different environments they had colonized. They lived without fixed shelters in the open, in trees, in temporary light huts, and sometimes in caves. But about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, this suddenly changed. In a relatively short period of a few thousand years, different human societies in Eurasia, Africa, and America transitioned to a completely different lifestyle, one based on agriculture, the domestication of plants into crops and of animals, and a sedentary life with fixed settlements. This transition may be the most important step in human history toward the development of civilization. Agriculture became the base of human subsistence, and the productivity gains that came with it allowed the appearance of food surpluses, which meant that these societies could sustain people not working in food production or larger populations. They could trade more than they did before, or they could start a process of accelerated technical discoveries led by craftsmen and later scholars. At the same time, their political organizations and economies were deeply transformed by this new order. The first towns, then the first cities could appear, followed by the first states. The ownership of productive assets began to exist, with all the consequences this brought on human societies. These are just a few aspects of this revolution, a radical change that is also called the Neolithic Revolution or Agricultural Revolution. And this is a story I will tell you about tonight. Why this transition? How did it happen? And what were the consequences? This is a vast topic, and we have a lot to discuss. But first, allow me to take a few moments of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more from it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page. Because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to 25 exclusive episodes. We add a new one every month, and you can listen and download all the episodes with and without background sounds. And as a token of gratitude, we offer advance releases to our patrons. We have added links to Patreon, as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find them in the description of the episode. But that all can wait. For now, Before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. Our journey begins more than 10,000 years ago in prehistoric times. The geologic period we live in is called the Holocene, and it began around 12,000 years ago, after the previous period called the Pleistocene, better known as the Ice Age, a period of about 2.5 million years, during which the genus Homo, the group of species to which we belong, diversified and colonized the earth. Different species of Homo populated the planet. They were given names like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo neanderthalensis, and more recently others. The family tree of the genus is still a work in progress. It has changed a lot in the past 40 to 50 years with new discoveries. If you are interested in hearing more about this, you can listen to the episode I made about the Ice Age, the Pleistocene, which summarizes the current state of understanding of our origins, from the first representatives of Homo to the species we belong to, Homo sapiens, which indeed replaced all others and became the dominant human species on Earth. Prehistory began in the Pleistocene, and as you know, the characteristics that differentiated Homo sapiens from their predecessors, apart from physical differences, were various cultural traits that included the systematic use of tools made of various materials, such as wood or stone. Homo sapiens was not the first species of Homo to use tools, and various animal species also use tools occasionally. But what made a major difference was the variety and, over time, the improvement of these tools, together with the species' intelligence, in the sense that it had the capacity to adapt, to conceptualize, to express itself through language and art forms, and also a high capacity to transmit information and knowledge to new generations. New individuals of the species are educated. They receive a legacy that becomes part of who they are, a legacy to which they can keep adding and then transmit to their offspring. We are beings of culture on a level that no other species on Earth can compare to, and we were already beings of culture long before the appearance of agriculture and sedentary life. We have been for tens of thousands of years. The revolution we are discussing tonight is one of lifestyle. Before it began, for hundreds of thousands of years, humanity had lived by foraging in nature. Prehistoric humans were constantly on the lookout for prey to hunt and plants to gather. Hence the term hunting and gathering, which is used to describe the existence of prehistoric humans. Oftentimes, the existence of hunters and gatherers was a very mobile one, certainly out of necessity. Staying all the time in the same place could quickly exhaust food resources, whereas traveling, possibly following prey that also migrated throughout the year, was more sustainable when it came to food procurement. These hunters and gatherers lived in small groups based on prehistoric archaeological records, probably a few dozen individuals at most, forming tribes. And because the world was scarcely populated, they probably rarely encountered other humans. So for hundreds of thousands of years, this was what life was like for humanity. The population only grew very slowly because mortality was high and conditions of comfort and hygiene were rather rough. However, archaeology suggests that the diet of these prehistoric humans was relatively well balanced, and they did not starve. They depended completely on their environment for food, so obviously that was precarious. But this environment provided a variety of plants and animals. Actually, I will elaborate on this later. But when parts of humanity switched to agriculture, this meant a more reliable and steadier supply of food, but also one that was less varied. We will see that even though the transition to agriculture permitted plenty of technical discoveries, allowed the sustaining of larger populations, and permitted the blooming of human culture and civilization, it also had negative consequences, starting with health due to a less varied supply of nutrients, or due to the proliferation of pests like rodents, insects, bacteria, and viruses. So the effects went both ways, positive and negative, and it is unclear whether the health of humans improved or deteriorated at the time of this transition. But we will return to this later on too. When we think of agriculture, one of the first images that comes to mind is the cultivation and harvesting of cereals. Actually, wild cereals were harvested before agriculture appeared. They were one of the types of food that humans collected while foraging. We know this thanks to the study of different flint blades that were used to cut cereals. The oldest traces of such harvesting were found in the Middle East, in what is now northern Israel, and date to about 23,000 years ago, a time that belonged to the late Paleolithic in that region. 23,000 years ago. This was more than 10,000 years before agriculture. So we know that for thousands and thousands of years, groups of humans spread around the world, living this nomadic or mostly nomadic lifestyle. Across all these generations, they certainly acquired a good knowledge of the plants and animals around them, an understanding, an intelligence of their environment that may have served as preparation for the transition to agriculture. But what was the trigger for it? What was the set of factors that made it occur in different parts of the world that were not in contact with each other? Because one striking characteristic of the beginnings of agriculture is that it was invented several times in different parts of the world and thousands of years apart. Yet it seems to have had the capacity to appear spontaneously in human societies, provided a certain number of conditions were present. About 11,000 years ago, it happened in this region of the Middle East called the Fertile Crescent, which stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Then about 2,000 years later, it also appeared in China and in the highlands of New Guinea, at the extreme southeast of Asia. About 4,000 years later, agriculture began in Mexico and in the north of South America, regions that were not connected at all with China or the Middle East. At about the same time, it also appeared in 3 different parts of sub-Saharan Africa that were not connected to one another. These regions were Ethiopia, the Sahel, and West Africa. So it seems this invention of agriculture kept happening in different corners of the world. Why was that? What is the dynamic in human societies or in their environment that made them settle and start to cultivate the land and domesticate plants and animals? Why did they radically change their lifestyle like this? There are several theories about it that are not mutually exclusive. Several could be true at the same time. A first hypothesis has to do with the rise in temperature that would have made agriculture more valuable than before in different parts of the world. And it is true that around 12,000 years ago, there was a significant and long-standing rise in global temperatures. This rise is the reason why a separation has been made between the period before the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, and our period, the Holocene. Jumps in temperature were not a new thing. They were also observed during the Pleistocene, which was not uniformly cold. But the difference was that this new regime of global temperatures remained stable for a long time, for thousands of years. So the beginning of agriculture certainly has something to do with temperatures or with the climate, because it happened at roughly the same time, at least in the Middle East. That could be a coincidence, but given that temperatures, precipitation, winds, and marine currents are all interconnected and interdependent, and given that these conditions deeply affect the viability of agriculture, it is highly likely that climate change at the time was a game changer that made agriculture a more attractive way of procuring food. Actually, there is no proof of that, but maybe attempts at cultivation and a settled life had taken place before. Maybe they were undertaken regularly by tribes and then abandoned because they did not work. They were not valuable until they became so thanks to the rise in global temperatures. So this explanation based on temperature is attractive, appealing, and it certainly played a role by making agriculture more productive. But it cannot really be considered the only factor, because this coincidence between climate change and the rise of agriculture only works in the Fertile Crescent, the first region where agriculture emerged, as far as we know. And every other part of the world, it took thousands of years longer. So there were certainly other triggers that were not entirely dependent on the environment and may have had to do more with human societies themselves. An old theory linking climate change and agriculture held that changes in sea currents as temperatures rose had made the Middle East drier than before, which would have pushed human communities to seek refuge or find their subsistence in oases. In these places, they would have been put in close contact with plants and animals that had also moved into such oases to find food. This would, at the same time, have discouraged nomadic lifestyle, since everything was now close at hand in the oasis, and facilitated the domestication of plants and animals. This theory was developed more than a century ago, and for some time it was seen as a solid hypothesis. But not anymore, because it appears that its premises were mostly probably wrong. Based on modern climate science, the regions of the Fertile Crescent did not become drier 12,000 years ago. They became wetter. And so, the whole desertification theory, with oases concentrating plants, animals, and human life, no longer made sense. It fell apart. So what could be the more cultural or human-driven causes of the transition to agriculture? There are hypotheses for these too. One is that the move to agriculture was forced by demography. I told you before that the prehistoric nomadic lifestyle was rough, but it worked. And apart from collapses that could be provoked by major disasters, such as massive volcanic eruptions and a subsequent drop in global temperatures, humankind tended to expand, multiply, and colonize new regions of the world. It was slow, but there was demographic growth to some extent. And if you add to this a rise in temperature that made food more abundant and the climate of many regions milder and more comfortable for humans, you probably had an acceleration of demographic growth, a small demographic boom in at least some regions of the world. This could be a trigger, because nomadic life and hunting and gathering only work when human groups are relatively small and have a lot of space to move around. When groups become larger and are constantly bumping into other groups, it stops working as well. They need to procure food within a smaller area and stay where they are. This could have been a major incentive to stay put and start exploiting the land in a more intensive way than before, including the domestication of plants and their cultivation. One thing that deserves to be mentioned is that we cannot be sure the domestication of plants and animals took place at the same time. A few bones that could possibly come from domesticated animals have been found on archaeological sites where humans lived and have been dated to a few thousand years before the introduction of agriculture. So the domestication of plants and animals are two different processes that did not necessarily happen at exactly the same time. If the transition was driven by demography in regions that became more crowded than before, it is possible that it also happened smoothly rather than abruptly. It is possible, and many nomadic groups do it, to travel with domesticated animals and herds. It was also possible to plant seeds somewhere and keep traveling along a fixed route, a loop, meaning that you would come back to the place where you planted a few months later and could harvest what you had planted. This only works with plants that grow by themselves without irrigation or care, but it is possible with fruit trees or wild roots, for example. Another hypothesis that derives from demographic growth has to do with power dynamics that would have made agriculture necessary. What does that mean? When a group, a tribe, is very small, interpersonal interactions are quite intense, and no official or complex hierarchy is necessary. Power within this group appears or changes hands rather organically. But when the group becomes bigger and bigger, these direct interactions between its members decrease out of necessity. People know each other less, and this means authority has to be asserted in new ways by those who claim power or a commanding position. But how do you exert dominance or authority in a group in which not everyone knows you well? This type of question is at the very basis of any political organization. You can rule by terrorizing everyone, but this is unstable and quite dangerous. A more peaceful and, in many cases, more efficient way to assert power is to become a caretaker, someone who generates voluntary adhesion because you defend the group, protect its order, and offer something in return in terms of well-being. You need your displays of power to be visible and obvious in order to reach everyone in this larger group. Hence the idea, the hypothesis, that these larger groups of the late Neolithic started to hold more celebrations and feasts. Apart from being enjoyable experiences, these feasts could have been ways of keeping groups together, binding people, avoiding risks of secession, and also allowing tribal chiefs to demonstrate that they could provide for their people, that they had benefits to offer. Feasts and ostentatious displays of abundance require large quantities and a certain variety of foods. That can be a problem for a nomadic group. It is difficult to pull off for nomads who travel. They carry limited quantities of food with them, and they cannot really plan ahead what they will eat a few days later. Agriculture, in contrast, with harvests and animals that can be eaten whenever required, is, in that sense, much better adapted to a group that celebrates through feasting. And so, the change of lifestyle could have been a way to adapt to the political needs of larger groups of humans, larger societies that might otherwise no longer have been able to maintain their coherence if they had kept traveling. The choice to settle and cultivate the land, in that case, would have corresponded to a social and political need. This sounds intellectually plausible, but it will most probably always remain theoretical because it cannot be proven. So as you see, the possible reasons for this transition are various. And even though it is hard to say which factors played a greater role than others, it is likely that the agricultural revolution was the product of an interaction between an environment that had become more favorable with the warming of the Holocene and the organizational needs or aspirations of human groups. This evolution was probably unavoidable under these circumstances because it kept happening in different parts of the world that were not connected. As we saw, first in the Fertile Crescent, then in New Guinea, China, Mesoamerica, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Each of these regions was a starting point from which agriculture radiated without fully eliminating nomadism. But the pure hunting and gathering lifestyle became almost extinct over the following millennia. Even nomads started to travel with herds of domesticated animals, which is a form of food production. Obviously, these different regions where agriculture emerged had different plants and animals available, different climates, and the development and diffusion of agriculture followed different paths. So let's review these differences, starting with the oldest agricultural region, the Levant. We would recognize the plants cultivated in the first fields of the Fertile Crescent. They would be familiar to us, but they would also look archaic, with smaller seeds and overall less to eat per grain or vegetable than we are used to. The cereals were domesticated in this region include wheat and barley, as well as different legumes such as lentils, peas, and chickpeas. The process of selection is almost inseparable from agriculture because you plant what you grow well and what you want to eat. So while cereals that had very small seeds were discarded, so were plants that had a bitter taste or were difficult to cook. From one year or one season to the next, farmers spontaneously selected what they wished to sow. And so even without thinking much about it, the selection that would eventually lead to modern grains and vegetables began with agriculture. The same happened with animals. They were kept and chosen for reproduction based on how useful they were for work, as in the case of dogs or drought animals, for their meat or for their byproducts of domestication, such as milk or wool. This is another aspect we will return to later. It seems that farming spread to Europe from the Levant, and it took a few thousand years, around 7,000 years ago, farming had reached Greece. About 6,000 years ago, it had spread to the rest of the Balkans and Italy. Finally, it entered Spain, France, and Central Europe about 5,000 years ago, and it reached southern Scandinavia and Great Britain a little more than 4,000 years ago. It is believed that European agriculture came from the Levant because of the species of plants and animals involved. The ones that were cultivated from Portugal to Poland happened to be the same species that had been domesticated in the Middle East. This is confirmed by genetic data. It suggests that no domestication of livestock happened independently in Western Europe during the Neolithic. Domestic animals were introduced from the Middle East. This introduction was slow. It took roughly 2,500 years to travel from Greece to Denmark or Britain, and we do not exactly know whether the spread was due to agriculture societies migrating slowly across Europe, whether their neighbors adopted their techniques and converted to agriculture, or a combination of both, maybe. But it appears that in many parts of Europe, for centuries, nomadic hunter-gatherers, who technically still live in the Mesolithic, the intermediate period of the Stone Age, lived side by side with sedentary agricultural societies that practiced farming and were technically more advanced. By more advanced, I mean their tools, which were also made of stone but were more complex and efficient, and the practice of a number of crafts, such as pottery or weaving, on a level that was far superior in quantity and quality to that of the hunter-gatherers. Another birthplace of agriculture that appears to be completely separate is China, where agriculture actually appeared in two different regions, one in the north, around the Yellow River, and one in the south, around the Yangtze. This was 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, about 2,000 years after the Middle East. In the northern region, millet, which remains an important cereal, was first domesticated. Other plants were also first cultivated in that region. But thousands of years later, such as soybeans about 4,500 years ago, and fruits like oranges and peaches around the same time. In the southern region, the dominant cereal was rice, Asian rice. From there, it radiated throughout East Asia, including into northern China. Of this other region of agricultural development, we know that shortly after the establishment of agriculture, and by shortly I mean a few centuries, but at these time scales that is not very much, the two areas came into contact and exchanged techniques and species, which enriched their agricultural practices. In Africa, it is believed that 3 different areas developed agriculture independently. The first place to actually practice agriculture in Africa was the valley of the Nile in Egypt, but agriculture in Egypt came from the Levant. We know this because, as in Europe, the first cultivated plants and domesticated animals all came from the Levant. But distances in Africa are huge, and Egyptian agriculture did not spread much farther. Instead, agriculture was reinvented in 3 different areas. One was Ethiopia, the Ethiopian highlands, which is also one of the oldest continuously populated regions in the world. It is close to the Rift Valley region in Africa, believed to be the cradle of our species. Another was the Sahel, the transition zone between the Sahara, which is very arid and dry, and the wetter savannas and forests to the south. The soil nowadays is under pressure from desertification, with the Sahara expanding southward. It has been for decades, but thousands of years ago, conditions were more favorable to agriculture. The third area was in West Africa, in a large region stretching from Nigeria to Senegal. The plants domesticated in these 3 regions were very different. They included different varieties of millet. Specifically in Ethiopia, there were plants such as kat and teff, which are little known outside their region of origin. Kat is a flowering plant and teff is an annual grass that produces edible seeds. Coffee was also domesticated in Ethiopia, even though it was more anecdotal when it came to people's diet. In the Sahel, sorghum was domesticated, an important plant with edible seeds, while the rest of the plant can be used to feed animals. West Africa had African rice, which is much less common today because it was largely replaced by Asian rice, which has higher yields. But historically, mankind domesticated 2 different species of rice, and the second one, African rice, was cultivated in West Africa. So were, and still are, yams, which are a major source of starch in the region. Returning to the Far East, I told you that right after the Fertile Crescent, agriculture appeared in New Guinea, the large island east of Indonesia and north of Australia. One of the oldest crops identified there was taro, which is a root vegetable. Yam was also present in New Guinea, and a few thousand years later, these crops were joined by bananas and sugarcane, which were domesticated there. Finally, in North and South America, domesticated crops were very different, which is one of the many elements supporting the idea that American human societies were completely cut off from those of Eurasia and Africa for thousands of years. In Mesoamerica, that is to say, Central Mexico and Central America, maize, or corn, as well as bananas and squash were selected. In South America, potatoes and manioc played a similar role. Along these plants, there was also the domestication of animals. Some of the earliest domesticated animals include dogs, and this was before farming and possibly even before herding. The oldest traces of dog domestication have been found in East Asia and date about 15,000 years ago. Beyond dogs, some of the first domesticated species included sheep, goats, pigs, and in South America, llamas. Now that we have done this little overview of the possible causes and the timeline of the emergence of agriculture around the world. What were the consequences? What did the invention of agriculture change about the way humans lived, socialized, built, or even saw the world around them? What they believed in, and how they conceived their place in the world. Before starting to cultivate, turning wild species into allies or animals to be exploited, becoming less dependent on what nature offers every day, to an extent, this could hardly happen without an intellectual and conceptual revolution as well. So let's take these different aspects in order. First, what did agriculture change in human societies? It would be tempting to suppose that agriculture helped or accompanied a demographic boom around the world, more food security by staying put instead of traveling into the wilderness, more comfort. This could lead to an increase in the population. But this is rather counterintuitive. This is not what is observed. Estimates of the world's population from 10,000 years ago have to be treated very cautiously. There are only orders of magnitude derived from estimates of population density based on what nature could provide, as well as deductions made from archaeological records. So maybe the real figures were only half as large, or perhaps 2 or 3 times higher than the figures I'm going to give you. What is relevant here is that no dramatic increase in population was observed immediately after the introduction of agriculture. By 10,000 BC, that is to say, 12,000 years ago, the world's human population is estimated to have been around 4 million, less than 1,000th of what it is today, with a slow growth pattern that took it to about 5 million by 8,000 BC. But then, as agriculture was introduced to a growing part of the world's population, instead of accelerating, population growth remained relatively flat for several millennia. The real demographic takeoff began later, around 6,000 years ago. But why is that? Why did the introduction of living conditions that apparently were more favorable have this counterintuitive effect of slowing demographic growth? Here again, there are theories, and they revolve around the negative side effects of sedentary life. I mentioned it earlier. Agriculture may have permitted a steadier supply of food, but it probably also deteriorated the variety and quality of people's diets, at least initially. Nutritional standards declined. That sounds counterintuitive, but it is supported by archaeology and the study of skeletons. On average, the transition to a cereal-based diet, which also meant less variety in plants and fewer animal proteins, came with an increase in infant mortality, shorter stature, and an overall decrease in life expectancy. A number of deficiencies that were not commonly observed among hunters and gatherers were found in ancient agricultural societies. There were more infectious, inflammatory, and degenerative diseases, possibly favored by a diet too heavily based on cereals, and lacking certain vitamins or minerals. This caused pathologies such as anemia and mineral disorders such as osteoporosis, and dental problems were also observed. This could be one explanation for the absence of strong demographic growth over several thousand years. Agriculture may have improved the quantity of food, but on the other hand, it affected the quality of the diet. Another unintended consequence of farming could have been the multiplication of pests around human settlements due to higher population densities. Rodents and insects living on human food stores and waste would have proliferated, and with them, pathogens. Yet another possibility is that fixed settlements made conflicts and wars between groups more likely and more frequent when people become attached to a certain land on which their survival depends, instead of simply moving away when the presence of neighbors becomes troublesome. The likelihood of conflicts over land becomes much higher. So despite producing more calories and improving comfort, agriculture may also have stimulated conflicts, and this too could have limited population growth and life expectancy. This points to another consequence of sedentary life, farming and herding. Prehistoric groups of hunters and gatherers probably ignored the concept of property or ownership beyond personal possessions such as clothes, tools, weapons, and maybe a few ornaments or pieces of jewelry. There was little to possess in these groups. No permanent houses, no land, no herds of animals, and no reserve of value like precious metals, because simply there was nothing to buy. Transitioning to settled life is a revolution, not just because you stay put, but because it has many consequences for how society actually works. One of these is the emergence of the concept of property. Who owns the land? Who owns the permanent shelters that people now live in? Who owns cattle and other herds of animals that can be considered productive assets? So, with the emergence of these questions, secondary consequences of settled life appeared. The need for laws, for new social codes, new rules, new relationships of power, and greater distinctions between individuals based on their wealth and power within their community. In a hunting and gathering tribe, social status may depend on your capacity to contribute to the food supply, or your physical strength, on your fertility, or your craftsmanship, maybe. And these remained valuable qualities in a settled society. But a new factor of social status became property, which would compensate for someone's physical weakness or become an attribute of power. That changed society and turned property into something desirable, whether for status, material security, or comfort. Another social consequence is an increased specialization of people, as we also saw at the beginning. The increased food production was what allowed a minority to do something other than produce food all the time. Craftsmen, priests, warriors, and commanders are people who spend all or part of their time on activities other than food production or preparation. These functions multiplied with settlements, allowing their faster technical improvements and discoveries, and they also contributed to a completely changed society with new hierarchies and a more complex organization. These functions existed before, and indeed there was technical progress throughout prehistory, but the Neolithic revolution acted as an accelerator, a dramatic one. Another possible consequence of the agricultural revolution concerns humans' perception of their relationship with nature and their pace in the world. What I mean by this is that when you live a nomadic life on the land, hunting and foraging, you are part of nature and need to adapt to it completely in order to survive. You have no control over your environment. This changes just a little at first, and then more and more as you settle and start farming or raising domesticated animals. Nature is no longer something that you simply take as it is. It becomes something that you can transform and exploit, at least to an extent. Even today, we are not fully independent from nature, obviously, and climatic or geological disasters can still deeply affect us. But the environments in which most of us live are highly artificial or have been transformed by mankind. Our houses, our gardens, our cities, and even our villages are largely man-made and controlled. There are elements taken from nature, but very little wilderness. Even in many forests where we might go for a walk, some places almost look like untouched nature, but they are not. There is a reason why we will not stumble upon a wild animal like a wolf. It is because wild animals have learned to fear us, or because in many places we eliminated them. So apart from truly remote and wild regions, we have modified nature, for better or worse. We changed our relationship with it by seeing it as something to be transformed, something to be exploited, instead of simply accepted as it is. To varying degrees, all societies that practiced agriculture and domesticated animals, including relatively simple traditional societies, changed their view of nature by doing so. This certainly facilitated the process of mentally separating humans from their environment. Some scholars have argued that the evolution of beliefs and religions in increasingly settled and complex societies, from animism, the belief that spirits inhabit natural things and phenomena, to polytheism, and later monotheism, with a single God believed to have created humans in his image, could illustrate this evolution in the conception of nature and our distance from it, from humble inhabitants of nature to masters of it. This is another debate, but the point is that agriculture and settlement were probably prerequisites for this intellectual or conceptual revolution to take place. One last example of the deep changes brought about the agricultural revolution could be the multiplication of products that became available to humans contributing to enrich their material life. When you think about it, as a hunter, animals are interesting essentially for their meat, and to a lesser extent for their skin, fur, or possibly their bones. But you kill them first and only exploit the carcass of an animal once. In contrast, domestication made a wide range of animal products and services available to humans, elevating their comfort. There was still skin, leather, and fur, but now also milk, eggs, wool for clothing, even manure to fertilize fields, or when dried to be used as fuel. There were also services such as traction for farming and assistance in herding. If you think about dogs, for example, this could be one of the foundations of a much more complex material culture, with plenty of new objects, new types of clothing, and places of armor that could be produced. Animal products could also be used as ingredients. With milk, eggs, and flour, you have the basis of much bread making and many pastries too. So this is why the agricultural revolution may be the single most important event in the history of Homo sapiens, the change that made possible civilizations, states, and the material and conceptual cultures that have emerged since then. All of this became possible because 4,000 years ago, more than half of the world's population had already transitioned to farming societies or nomadic pastoralist societies, that is to say, nomads traveling and ensuring their subsistence with herds of domesticated animals. By 2,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers were largely limited to very remote regions of the world, and agriculture had become the norm on all inhabited continents. This included people in North and South America, in Europe, and in parts of Africa, Asia, and Australia that lived relatively far from the original centers of agricultural development. The practice has spread, and many of the material and cultural traits of our societies, many of these invisible concepts that shape us as people, had their origins in that upheaval that was the Neolithic Revolution. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or, if you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.